Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On this episode of Horns, we listen to a discussion with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, authors of The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. Many of our listeners will recall James Baker, not Peter the author, as the Secretary of State for George H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War, and the man who helped to orchestrate the remarkably broad coalition that prosecuted the First Gulf War. Indeed, those are substantial diplomatic achievements. But as Glasser and Baker point out, James Baker's accomplishments were much broader than that, and included substantial involvement with political campaigns, including running the re-election campaign of Gerald Ford and others. One of the authors describes him briefly as a cross between Karl Rove and Henry Kissinger. The conversation was conducted at the University of Texas, Austin, and is hosted by Bobby Chesney, head of the Strauss Center, and Will Imboden, head of the Clements Center on National Security. Let's listen in.
This occasion is brought to you jointly by the Clements Center for National Security and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. I'm Professor Bobby Chesney. I'm the director at the Strauss Center. For my part, there couldn't be a more relevant biography. I hold the James A. Baker III chair here at the University of Texas at Austin. And the Strauss Center that I direct, it's named for Bob Strauss, who plays a recurring part in the story. I want to welcome all of you, both on my own behalf and that of my friend and colleague, Dr. Will Imboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center. The Clements Center is named for Bill Clements, yet another legendary Texan who made his mark on the world and in Washington in much the same era. Now, for my part, my job is to be silent as quickly as possible. Let me do a very brief introduction that barely scratches the surface of the amazing accomplishments of our co-authors presenting today. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. He's the author of previous outstanding books, including another book he also co-wrote with Susan Glasser, Kremlin Rising, and the book The Breach about the Clinton impeachment. I could say much more, but in the interest of time, I'll stop there. Susan Glasser is a staff writer at The New Yorker. She writes the weekly Letter from Trump's Washington. As I said, she's co-author with Peter of Kremlin Rising, endless other accomplishments like founding Politico magazine, being editor-in-chief of foreign policy. We could go on all day, but we're here to hear from them, not from me. So let me just close by saying these are journalists and authors of national stature at the peak of their craft, and they've brought us a really amazing definitive biography of a critical part of our history, James A. Baker. Peter and Susan, the floor is yours.
Well, gosh, thank you, Bobby, so much. And thank you, Will, both of you for having us. We are delighted to be with you. We only wish it were in person. I have to say, one of the things we were most looking forward to about this book tour was coming back to Austin in particular and spending some time there with our friends and with the city, which we have come to love an awful lot. As Washingtonians, one of the great joys of doing this book in the last 7 years has been spending so much time in Texas, in Houston and Austin and Dallas and around the state. We won't talk very long. We'll just open up the questions as fast as possible just to give a quick taste of the book for those who might or might not remember Jim Baker. I think in Texas he's pretty well known to everybody, but sometimes the younger generation might be more of a fading view. We decided to do this book because we thought, first of all, Jim Baker had a role in almost every major thing that happened in Washington from the end of the Watergate to the end of the Cold War. He really was instrumental in so many major changes in politics and in foreign affairs during that period. And it was stunning to us in 2013 when we got started on this book that nobody had ever done this before. You know, he was Secretary of State during a time when our world literally changed. The Soviet Union collapsed, Germany reunified, we had the first Gulf War, changing the rules of the road of international order, the Madrid Peace Conference. All of that by itself would make for a pretty interesting book. In fact, other people have written books like that. Jeff Engel, our friend at SMU, has a book out on that period. I think I'm looking forward to Will Imboden's book that he's working on right now. We decided Baker's story actually is more interesting than just that because he also ran 5 presidential campaigns. So imagine Karl Rove and Henry Kissinger rolled into one, basically. He had his hand in so many different things. And we also thought his story told the story of Washington in a lot of ways, how things worked back then and how things have changed since then.
Well, look, I think that's right. And, we started this book 7 years ago. Obviously, we're not going to get the land speed record for finishing a project, but this was, back in the dim recesses of the Obama era, right? Remember that? But I think both Peter and I already felt that this was a moment of real dysfunction in Washington. And it made us think that Baker was a great subject, not only for telling his own remarkable story, and really there was never anyone before or since, at least in modern American politics, who assembled the record that he assembled of, essentially holding such a diverse array of top Washington roles and flourishing in them. But then it wasn't just a one-man story, that it really was the story of Washington and a study in power as it was exercised in this crucial period of the late Cold War. And, that seemed like a period that was so far away from the dysfunction and inward lookingness of our own moment. Peter and I are both, in a way, children of that 1989 generation. And our own son, it comes from a really different moment in time, a time of American retrenchment and the 2008 financial crisis and the sort of division and dislocations of the Trump era. Whereas, for us, 1989, we forget this, was this incredible and even optimistic moment in geopolitical history and in Washington, right? It was a moment when it seemed that democracy and freedom really were on the march. And initially we thought, well, let's go back to that Washington and see, what worked, what didn't, what it was like, and what lessons there might be for Washington today. Now, of course, it took on, I would say, both a darker and a more urgent cast over the course of our doing this book. The rise of Trump becomes this sort of interesting kind of theme and leitmotif of our conversations with Baker as he struggles to come to terms with the hostile takeover, is what he and others think of it as, of this party by a president who doesn't really believe the same things and yet who might just be the logical extension of the development of the modern GOP that Baker sees as his proud legacy. So, I think for Peter and I, it really was a way of connecting the present and the past, and also looking at the past and understanding, are there things that worked in Washington before that could work again? Is that a moment in time that's definitively gone? And Jim Baker as a character, I must say, proved to be even more interesting to me than I had originally anticipated. We're familiar with his dazzling resume, and especially you in Texas know well, what this particular Texan brought to Washington and to the world stage. But I don't think that I really understood the extent to which he really was not only sort of a zealot of modern political history, showing up in the middle of all these key random events, from the 2000 presidential election disputed recount in Florida to the 1976 Republican convention, which is the very last contested convention in American political history. So that was really, I think, an amazing experience for Peter and I, who spent decades as Washington journalists, to be able to go back and revisit that. But it was also an immersion in a story of Texas and the West and a political culture that was very distant from all that. In fact, Jim Baker, as we learned only in doing this book, for him, politics was actually a rebellion and a defiance of a family who saw itself as builders and pillars of Houston, and whose family motto ever since the Civil War was "stay out of politics." And yet here's this guy who comes in what must be the world's most successful midlife career change, doesn't even get to Washington until he's 45 years old. And then within 1 year, is running the presidential campaign of the incumbent president of the United States, Jerry Ford, from an obscure position at the Commerce Department. So I think just, from the point of view of us as historians, or amateur historians at least, and journalists, a reminder of the accidents of history as well as its inevitability. There were big forces at play in the end of the Cold War. Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush did not cause the Berlin Wall to fall, but they shaped what happened next. And I think for Peter and I, it's really useful in our day-to-day jobs to remember that history is not inevitable as it seems in hindsight, and that individual actors played a key role here. And Jim Baker might have been, in that sense, Tom Donilon, actually, Barack Obama's national security advisor, one time we told him we were working on this project, and he said that he was really looking forward to it because he considered Jim Baker to be the most powerful unelected official since World War II in the United States. And, I think Peter and I ultimately came to agree with that conclusion. There's much that's relevant today to Baker's remarkable career in sort of rising in politics and succeeding in an array of institutions. You could kind of read this book even as a leadership handbook. And yet at the same time, it also, I think, was a marriage of man and moment. That was a time when Washington ran the world, when the consequences on the geopolitical stage were such that it did operate as a constraint on our very fierce domestic partisan fights and politics. Those things are both gone today. America is no longer an unchallenged superpower, and our politics no longer operate within the guardrails that they did in the time of Jim Baker. So, again, I think it's just been an incredible experience for us working on this book together. And yes, we are married, and yes, we're still talking to each other. So it is actually possible to write a book with your spouse and come out of it on the other end. But I will say that there are 15 years in between the first book that we wrote together and this one. But no, really, it's a wonderful privilege to have had a subject like Jim Baker. And I think for both Peter and I, what sealed the deal in doing this book actually was finding out that no one had ever written a biography of Jim Baker. And we saw it as a unique opportunity for us to do so, to tell a big story about Washington and American politics too. So I really am looking forward to your questions. We're not going to talk you to death. I hope you fire away some good ones at us today. And thank you so much for tuning in and sharing some of your time on a beautiful fall afternoon with us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Peter and Susan. And I think you heard this earlier from Bobby, but let me reiterate for our audience: as much as you're learning about Jim Baker now, you're going to learn more over the course of our discussion. The way to really learn about him is to buy and read the book.
We didn't pay them to say that, but we do encourage that.
Okay, that's right. So let me toss my first question to you, and Professor Chesney is going to have a question or two as well. And let me preface this, but I'm a very big fan of Jim Baker. I think he deserves all the accolades for a remarkable array of accomplishments. But the knock that one will hear on him sometimes in some foreign policy and strategy circles is that he was more of a manager than a strategist, right? That he doesn't necessarily have the strategic vision that one would get with a Kissinger or even a George Shultz. But it's more about a negotiator. Let's find the deal. Let's tell me what the goal is. Tell me the diplomatic hill to take, and I will take it. So on and so forth. First, and you touch on this sometimes in the book, but tell us more how much you think that critique is fair or not. But let me ask you another thing: do we overrate strategy? When you look at his accomplishments and you look at the state of the world today, maybe we need some more competent managers and implementers and negotiators than necessarily a lot of strategic visionaries running around. So maybe the very premise of the question is somewhat flawed. Love to hear your thoughts.
I think it's a great question. In fact, it really does go to the heart of the nature of the job and the nature of the man, right? So if you were to think about the two secretaries of state that we talk about the most in the last 50 years or so, it would be Kissinger and Baker, right? And they're so different. In fact, we went to see Kissinger, and he remarked on how different they were. He said, he basically said, I'm a geopolitical strategist, and he's not, which is true. And I actually think that Baker wouldn't deny that. I think Baker agrees with that. He's not a geopolitical thinker in that sense. He wouldn't come up with some overarching vision for how the world should work. He is, I think, an engineer rather than an architect, right? To take your phrasing, in effect. But at the same time, I don't think that there are that many who were real visionaries. I mean, Kissinger, yes. Maybe you could say Shultz. But I think most secretaries of state have actually been political actors who may have had some foreign policy bent, like a John Kerry or whatever, Rex Tillerson in his own way because he'd been an executive. The truth is, none of them, I think, very few of them anyway, were Kissingerian in that sense. And I don't think you have to be a Kissinger to be successful. I think because Baker, and what Susan says is right, Baker didn't make the Berlin Wall fall, he didn't make the Soviet Union collapse, but he took those forces of history and then he helped channel them in a direction that was useful for the United States and arguably for the world, right? It wasn't inevitable that the Cold War end peacefully. wasn't inevitable that Germany reunify in a more or less happy way that made more or less people accept it. And those, I think, are the moments when you see, a person like a Baker come to the fore, somebody who's able to he's not a revolutionary, but he will take the forces that he sees in front of him and try to find ways of harnessing them, channeling them, and bringing them to an end.
Well, that's right. I mean, look, you talk about him as a manager. What do you need in a crisis? You need a crisis manager. And frankly, I'm sure a lot of people on this call would agree that a little bit of sheer competence from our government might go a long way, and that competence shouldn't be a partisan value or an ideological attribute. And that, so first of all, nothing wrong with competence. And I do think if you had to actually ask me, a gun to the head, what is one word that I would use to describe Baker, sheer competence is probably would come out pretty quickly there. But to the question of managerialness, look, the crisis came to him and Bush at a moment when they were, extremely well positioned to deal with it. And in a crisis, you don't want an ideologue who has an inflexible view colored by their own definitions of what things should be. You want somebody to see the world as it is. Now, you probably always want somebody to see the world as it is, but you particularly want somebody to see the world as it is in the middle of a chaotic, fast-moving crisis. And so I think in that sense, you're talking about a marriage of man and moment. A visionary with the rest of the world relatively stable might come up with the idea of an opening to China as a way of pivoting in the Cold War to a new phase, right? And that arguably is Kissinger's greatest achievement, although, whether you think that was Nixon's idea or Kissinger's is an interesting debate in and of itself. But I do think that, the end of the Cold War was not that moment. Where you wanted somebody who had an unyielding view of what should be. And I was struck by something that Margaret Tutwiler, Baker's really longtime, not just aide, but almost a Baker whisperer, said to us. And again, this is someone who's as close to him as any person in the world outside of his family. She said he's a ruthlessly unsentimental person, basically. Absolutely,
She mean that in the best of ways.
Not governed. Well, that's what I'm saying is that, not governed by sentiment or impulse, but, really given to absolutely understanding the world as it is. And I think that's the key to understanding him both personally, but to this conversation professionally and what he brought to. Clearly, he had a lot of other skills as a natural diplomat that we could talk about as well.
Let me ask a question about his years with Reagan, and especially the transition that the book documents so well of his role as someone suspected by the long-term Reaganites as an outsider who wasn't a true believer, wasn't there for the cause. And then this sort of crowning moment, you conclude that part of the career with Reagan's observation that he had really earned his spurs. And this, notwithstanding the lack of sentimentality, this what must have been a meaningful moment when Reagan says, you are a Reaganite. And the question is, did he become a Reaganite over those years, or did the meaning of what it was to be a Reaganite actually change and shift towards the more pragmatic world that he represented?
That's a great question and a great observation. You're right about that. And I think nobody else has picked up on what Reagan said, as you just did, when he when he basically says farewell to Baker at the end of his time as Secretary of Treasury. He says, "You have been a Reaganite." And boy, that did mean a lot, I think, to Baker, because he'd been so targeted again and again for being insufficiently committed to the cause. What Baker would tell you is, of course, he was committed to the cause. He just wanted the cause to actually get done. He just didn't want to waste time on things that weren't going to get done. So, did Reagan promise to get rid of the Department of Education in the campaign of 1980? Yeah, he did. Did Baker do anything about that? No, he didn't. Is that Baker not letting Reagan be Reagan? Or is that Baker saying, hey, why waste time on a proposal that a Democratic House is never going to pass? And instead, let's focus on what we can pass. What we can pass is Reagan's economic program, his tax cuts. We could pass, we could pass some budget cuts. We could pass some things that Reagan actually, defense spending increases. We could pass things that Reagan stands for, that are core to Reagan's beliefs, and not waste time on the fights that don't matter. So I think Baker, in effect, defined Reaganism, right? Reagan is the overall thinker and overall, visionary, if you will, but Baker then translates it into a reality. And that's what Reagan meant. Reagan was a more pragmatic person probably than people thought he was. So when they complain, let Reagan be Reagan, they're taking shots at Baker. They're taking shots at Baker because they really don't want to take shots at Reagan, even though it's really Reagan who wants Baker to do what he's doing.
Well, and I think this is really an important issue too, because it goes to what's so different about today. And it goes to what was Jim Baker and possibly for that matter, Ronald Reagan's definition of being a president about it. It wasn't about being, someone who gave speeches. It wasn't about somebody whose, greatest accomplishment was a tweet. It was about the idea that if you're the president of the United States, you actually have to do something. And I do think that the very definition embedded in Baker's handling of the role of Reagan's chief of staff was the notion that Reaganism actually would be nothing and that Reagan would not be a president for the history books if he failed to accomplish anything, but simply talked a lot about it. That he didn't see being a speech giver as being the sum total of what a presidency is about. And I do think that's a profound statement about what politics meant then and what it is now.
I'm going to ask a question that in some ways follows up on the last two, drawing some of these themes together. And again, in our present political moment, there's a lot of, I think, appropriate lamentations about we're not valuing competence and expertise enough. And those often go together, competence and expertise. But one thing I really appreciate and very about your book is you show that Baker is, of course, uber competent. Susan, you even said that's the word for him. But the interesting thing that you really highlight well is the three most significant positions he takes: White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of Treasury, and then Secretary of State. For each of those, he didn't bring much experience or expertise in. Like, he becomes White House Chief of Staff, the most powerful unelected position in the government, after having served 1 year at the Commerce Department. He becomes Secretary of the Treasury without any real knowledge of economics, any background in finance or industry, the places you usually get Secretary of Treasury. Then he becomes Secretary of State without any real substantial diplomatic experience. And so he doesn't have the usual, life of expertise that you would associate with those positions, but he has that competence. And so I'd just love to hear a little bit more on how did he actually learn the substance and the content of those positions? And then how did he perhaps tap the expertise of others serving under him for issues that he himself didn't have decades of expertise on?
Well, I think that's where you could say there's a kind of a leadership, version of the Jim Baker book to do as well, right? Because he's a classic example of somebody who was able to parachute into large and even forbidding bureaucracies and find a way to navigate it at the very top. He was sharp-elbowed, and he certainly made bureaucratic enemies within the system. At the State Department, the Career Foreign Service did not love him, to say the least. At the Treasury Department, same thing. So he was sharp-elbowed. But so I would say the big thing about Baker that applies probably to many managers or leaders of large institutions was that he was a supremely self-confident person who was more than willing to bring in and, in fact, to really use A-plus people. A lot of times you'll have a strong leader, but they're insecure and they won't bring in good people because they want to be the brightest light in the room. They want to sound familiar. They want to be, the smartest guy. They want to be, better than all the experts. That was not Jim Baker's way. He actually had what he called a plug-in team that he took with him from the White House to the Treasury Department, to the State Department. And these were all exceptionally talented people in their own right. Many of them knew much more. For example, Dick Darman, who was probably the most gifted policy entrepreneur of his generation, and he was crucial to Baker's success. He brought ideas and a framework of knowledge of how to work the levers of government that Baker did not have. But, you are right to spotlight this, Will. I mean, imagine when we did our interviews, Peter can speak to this. I was trying to, the sort of inner Soviet studies wonk, in me was like trying to say, like, well, what about, at Princeton, what was your background in the Soviet Union? And I'm sort of asking all these questions. And he finally says, well, I had a tennis coach in Houston who was a white Russian, who had fled the revolution. And he was really close to me, like a second father.
I just add one story. At the Treasury Department, he picks up the goal of rewriting the tax code, right? And Don Regan's Treasury Department had produced a plan for this that Baker inherits. And he looks at it and says, there's absolutely no way on earth this is going to pass. And he basically tosses it in the trash can. And he gathers a team on Saturday mornings to sit there and redo a tax plan. And he puts his feet and his boots up on the table, and he's chewing tobacco and spitting into the jar on the table. And what the people who were there recalled was that unlike the previous process where people said, what would be the most ideal version of a tax code? Baker wasn't interested in that. He didn't get into that. He said, what can pass? If we do this thing you're suggesting, who would be for it and who would be against it? How does this work in reality? And they produced a plan that ultimately, had to be adjusted, but eventually does pass. And that's Baker's gift. He's not going to tell you the best tax code. He's not going to give you a disquisition on the Treaty of Westphalia, but he will figure out how to get these things done. And that is a talent that is different than a good schooling in a subject area, but also necessary for success.
Let me take us in a slightly different direction. As much as I'm dying to keep the focus on international affairs and the issues that all of us spend our professional lives engaging with, and the things that are actually probably the reasons why most of the people watching have tuned in, and I want to take it in the following different direction to the personal side of his life and his family experiences, because the book, I think, clearly purposefully weaves in, as any good biography would, but it feels very purposeful, and I'm curious if it is, how much you were setting up almost like a counter narrative, a counterpoint. He's having all these endless, amazing professional successes, but there are a lot of struggles in sources of pain, lots of sources of pain in his family life and his personal life. And I just wanted to invite you both to reflect on this as a couple writing this book. What you felt might be going on beneath the surface, things that he didn't necessarily talk directly to you about, but insights you drew about. Was this just a story of someone who seals off those two worlds, and part of why he's finding so much success is because it's painful to look at some of the things he's dealing with at home? Or conversely, was a lot of his success in many ways stemming from, in some fashion, from those personal things?
Such a great and I think thoughtful question. That was, of course, the surprise of the book, right? Obviously, Peter and I embarked on the book because we knew of Baker's dazzling accomplishments and that he would enable us to tell a story of a Washington that no longer was, but might be relevant. What we didn't know actually was most of the personal stuff. And, I don't know about you guys, but I'm always a lover of biographies and reader of biographies. And I tend to actually like the first part of the books better anyways, because that really is the part that I don't know much about. Who is this person? Where do they come from? What shapes them? And so for Peter and I, look, Jim Baker is a man very much of the old school. He, was fully cooperative with this book, I should say, gave us enormous amount of full access to his papers, hours and hours of interviews, although it's not, of course, an authorized book. But, he's not a guy with a diary, unlike Richard Holbrooke and the wonderful George Packer biography of him called Our Man, which I highly recommend. But Holbrooke was practically toting, a personal historian around with him, a la David Petraeus, and he's writing down in his early 20s what his intellectual sources of, knowledge about the Vietnam War were. This is not, needless to say, Jim Baker, right? So we did have that challenge as biographers. And yet, I would tell you, Peter and I found it really remarkable that in his mid and late 80s, which is when we were working on this book, first of all, Baker is totally with it, but he was really forthcoming about this personal struggles and side of his life that we did not expect him to be, number one. Number two, I think I at least, we'll see what Peter says, came to understand, his political career almost as an act of rebellion against his family, and in particular against the sharp constraints of his father and the world of duty and obligation, as well as privilege that he came from. And it really was more than I imagined, the burden of being James Addison Baker III. By the way, he's actually the fourth James Addison Baker.
They never really explained that.
No.
We spent 7 years in the book. We haven't figured that out, why he's the third instead of the fourth.
That's right. And, his dad look, he told us, he's the one who told us, my dad, my friends and I called him the warden. And I thought, well, that's an aha moment, from a man who's not given to sort of armchair psychoanalysis. We found the documentary record that supported the image of a father who was deeply controlling to the extreme. We're talking to you all in Austin, the University of Texas. His father made him go. He was considering after the Marines and after going to Princeton, he wanted to be a lawyer like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather before him. He thought about Harvard or some other East Coast place. His father insisted that he go to the University of Texas Law School. Not only that, and he said yes, not only that, but he insisted once he got there that he ought to pledge the exact same fraternity. And, at this, Baker did protest. And he said, look, I'm married. I'm in my 20s. I have a baby. I don't want to do that. But his father insisted, and he went along with it. He was hazed by freshmen. And remember, this was the 1950s. This was, not today's version of pledging a fraternity. This was some extreme stuff. And to me, that was a very telling moment. So then just, quickly flash forward to your question, how did that shape him in this remarkable career? And then he suffers the tragedy of a first wife dying, a very problematic merger of two families with his second wife. It was sort of a Brady Bunch from hell, as opposed to, the TV version of the Brady Bunch. I would say that that's probably where he does have some real regrets, or at least sees himself as having transcended, and become his own person, perhaps in deciding to reject the family motto of stay out of politics, right? And so I think that's the narrative as he might tell it, where he, under some truth serum, I guess. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, look, he's not a tortured soul, right? I mean, obviously a lot of biographies that are great are about people who are, broken in some way psychologically or through their life's challenges or overcome this great adversity in that sense. Baker's not a tortured soul. He is a supremely confident person, but he did have a great deal of challenges in his personal life. And I think it's actually is revealing to see this person who seems so buttoned up, so perfectly coiffed and poised and controlled in a public setting for decades on the public stage, to know that at home, things were tough. He had a wife who died of cancer, and it was a tragedy, and he was left with 4 boys. He had, as Susan said, the marriage of his family to another family that didn't go so well at first. That was troubled. There was drugs. There was rebellion. There was acting out. And to know that somebody is dealing with that at home while still managing to perform on the public stage, I think is revealing, even if it's not, again, like some sort of a tortured soul.
Yeah. And so I know our time is coming to a close here, and we know you folks have a busy afternoon of other appearances, but it's been a treat, of course, to hear from Peter and Susan on so much of the behind-the-scenes work and their insights from the book. But there's no substitute for getting your own copy and reading the thing itself, and it really is fantastic.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.